Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. I know this is a campaign diary, but I'm going to front load some running the game advice because I think there is an important lesson I have to convey regarding last week's session. Welcome to the bridge of the Starship MCDM. We did play D&D last week, and we're going to do something tonight. Stay tuned. Last week's session was one entire combat, and I find the act of describing to you folks in the campaign diary combat on a blow-by-blow, round-by-round, action-by-action sequence to be really tedious and unfun. I typically just focus on the highlights of the combat, but we're probably going to talk a lot about the encounter design and what I expected to happen and then what actually happened, and we'll definitely describe and talk about what, the high-level bullet points of the adventure, but there is an important lesson to be learned from last week because we got a lot of feedback. We got people on the subreddit, we got people on the YouTube channel complaining about the low quality of last week's episode and how it was obviously scripted was one comment we got, and it was a 4-hour long ad for Strongholds and Followers, which if that seems like a mystifying comment, what they mean is that the players used their concordance, used their patrons and called upon powerful allies to help them out. And where do those ideas come from? And it seemed to some people who I don't think were paying close attention to the entire campaign thus far, it seemed to some people as though this was awfully pat, that, Lars called upon his god and got a pre-recorded answer from an actor friend of mine. That was awfully convenient. Surely Lars and Matt must have talked about this ahead of time. Lars even had a scripted speech that his prayer to Akamitsu. How obviously Matt and Lars sat down and talked about this and had this all planned out. And I think that it's important to talk about how I get my players to do the stuff that I want them to do without them even noticing that I have manipulated them into doing it. It's actually really easy. The part of the fun of Dungeons and Dragons is that the players can do anything. It's not a video game where there are only certain reactions and certain solutions to any given puzzle that the dev team have come up with ahead of time. The players can come up with any kind of crazy nonsense they want to. That's one of the exhilarating parts of it. I always am delighted when I am surprised by the plans that my players come up with. But the flip side of that is they can come up with crazy nonsense, and they spend an inordinate amount of time, as you know, if you have been a dungeon master at all, they spend an inordinate amount of time just coming up with incomprehensible gibberish. And you're like, how did you conclude that that is plausible or reasonable? That would never work. How do I steer them away from this nonsense and toward, if not the thing that I had expected them to do, this other thing that I think is really cool that they just came up with? And the way I do it, first of all, it helps that these are my friends and we hang out together outside the context of D&D. We go to D&D lunch together. I work with some of these folks. When I'm not working with the other ones, they come over and play games usually once a week. And so I get to hear them. I get to listen to them talking about all their plans. And here is my secret. This is the technique I use to get my players to do the things that I think are reasonable or the thing I had planned on them doing ahead of time. And that is I keep my mouth shut until they say something that I think is interesting and plausible or will lead them down the path that I had already written down in my prep notes. For instance, I was at the D&D lunch and a lot of the discussions that happen afterwards and the discussion that's ongoing in our private Discord between the players all talking about what they were planning on doing. And I had let them know subtly in various ways that the Black Iron Pact, that these guys, in fact, it was started with Phil saying, if these guys can do the kind of stuff we can do, we're screwed. He said, because I, as Slim, can easily take down our squishiest characters in one round. And that was a great statement for Phil to make. And it really helped me put the fear of the Black Iron Pact into the players. Over the course of the week, the players are starting to realize the Black Iron Pact, these guys could be really nasty. If they can do the kinds of things that we can do, are we screwed? Are we going to have to retreat? Are any of the players interested in just fighting to the death and in giving no quarter? And meanwhile, I'm saying nothing. And Lars said at one point, if worse comes to worse, I can call upon Akamitsu. And I had said nothing up to this point. They had all sorts of various plans of how they could escape if they wanted to, cast invisibility, stuff like that, use Big Cat's new ability to Dimension Door to get copper out of there. And I said nothing about any of that. I was just happy to hear them thinking tactically and strategically, and maybe we should have to run. But once Lars said I could use my concordance and call upon Akamitsu, I said, don't forget, though, that concordance has a flip side. If your god isn't happy with you or you've pestered them too often, then you could get cursed. In NetHack, you could get the ball and chain. And that I do that all the time. When the players come up with the idea that I've been waiting for them to come up with, or alternatively, this thing I'd never thought of, but I think is really cool, I don't say, hey, that's a cool idea, you should try that. I challenge them. I say, how are you going to do that? It almost always works. It almost always works. I say nothing during all their weird, crazy schemes and nonsense. And typically another player will talk the crazy schemer out of the stuff that they're proposing. And then once the players say something that is reasonable or awesome or the thing I had planned in the first place, that's when I chime in and I say, but what if that doesn't work? Me challenging them gets the gears working, gets them thinking, well, but we could do this, well, we could do that. And at that point, they are hooked. At that point, I've got them right where I want them. So me saying, don't forget though, concordance can go bad if you have been annoying or if you've not been a good priest. And Lars is like, yeah, but I don't think Akamitsu has any reason to be, unhappy with me. And I said, well, in my campaign, anytime you want to make any kind of negotiation check with another NPC, or in this case with your saint, then you're going to have to, if you do, you can make your roll, right, and add your bonus, whatever it might be. But if you do a little role playing, because this is your character using their charisma in order to try to persuade someone to do something, if you do a little bit of role playing, if you give a little speech, then you'll get a bonus on your roll. And that's true. That's been true, in my game now for 20 years. That is what prompted Lars to write his prayer out. I never said, hey, don't forget you guys have concordance and you can call upon your God anytime you want to. I waited for the players to bring that up and say, it comes down to it. There are several of us here who have powerful patrons, gods, or, elder dragons or whatever, that if worse comes to worse, we could call on. And that's when I said, don't forget, though, that can backfire. And as soon as I said that, the players' gears were turning and they're like, I don't think it would. But Anna definitely felt like calling on Asmodeus could have a downside, which those of you who are patrons at the $5 level or above, there's a link to the Patreon, saw my notes for last week. And I literally said, I don't know if Anna's going to call. I don't know if Judge is going to call on Asmodeus. He might not want to pay the price, which was exactly true. The goal of the encounter was to push the players to the point where they either had to seriously think about and talk about retreating, and I knew this was probably only going to happen after one or more characters died. That's typically the, oh goodness, it's time to get out of here sign. So at least one of us has to survive if we want to be able to go to our powerful allies and get them to resurrect our friends. One of us has to get out of here, or alternatively push them to start doing things like calling on their gods, which I think should be a normal part of any fantasy game, because this is a world in which the gods are real and grant you powers. So obviously, in a moment of desperation, if you are sufficiently high level and you have done good deeds in your god's name, they or their saint are going to intercede and do something, grant you some boon. And that's been a part of the tradition of the game I've run since the 1980s. It worked. My notes were basically just, what happens if this character calls upon their god? What happens if this character calls upon their god? What happens if this character calls upon their god? Don't forget the Black Iron Pact. They also have a saint that they worship, Ajax, who can send them help, and did. I had no real idea which of these characters were going to ultimately call upon their god, and it also occurred to me that Slim, they could haste Slim, and he could get 5 attacks in one round and chop off 3 heads, and they might never need to call upon their god. They might also just decide, let's get the heck out of here and not call upon their gods. But this is something that the heroes have been aware is a possibility ever since we started playing. In that sense, the encounter design was successful. My goal was to design a villain party that could challenge the heroes sufficiently to make them desperate, and that succeeded. I spent a lot of time on the Black Iron Pact because I wanted them to have abilities like PCs have, but I didn't want to have to manage 6 entire different character sheets, including 2 spellcasters, a priest and a wizard, and all of the spells they would have. I think the priest was 9th level. I think the wizard was 11th level. It's a ridiculous look in the monster manual, and it says, oh, this character is an 11th level spellcaster. Here are all the spells they have. They have this many 1st level spell slots. I'm like, why do I care about how many 1st level spell slots they have? There's no danger I'm ever going to use all of these. So instead, I focused the design of the Black Iron Pact on the data I needed to make the encounter challenging and interesting and fun on a moment-to-moment basis. And based on the reaction to the people watching it at the time, it seems to have worked. We played for 4 hours. We had over 2,500, 2,600 people watching the entire time, and it didn't have the huge dip it normally has after the break. People were super engaged, and many people in the Discord, on the subreddit, on Twitter, live in chat said, I don't think I've ever watched 4 hours of combat before, but that was nail biting. Obviously, there are people for whom that's not true. There's no matter what show we're talking about, whatever your favorite show is, there's somebody out there who, probably me, who doesn't like it. And so, yeah, there are some people obviously who didn't have a good time, but I was overwhelmed actually at how many people were engaged the whole time. And I think the stakes are obviously a big part of that, right? This was life and death, but also each round, the bad guys had cool, unique things they could do, just like the heroes do. And that meant stuff that aren't things that aren't in the player's handbook, things that I made up. And they were flavorful. They reinforced a lot of these characters' fantasy. Like, what does it mean to be the Master of Jackals, for instance? So I consider that design really successful, although the implementation, I think, was kind of a letdown because not all of the members of the Black Iron Pact were equally useful. They didn't all get the same amount of time from me as a designer. The wizard, for instance, got very little time from me. And my core design in focusing on the stuff the characters could do is not worry about things like what kind of equipment are they carrying, with one exception. I didn't worry about what kind of armor are they wearing. I could just give this character a 20 armor class and be certain that if I wanted to, by hook or by crook, I could come up with exactly what armor and items they were wearing and what their stats were that would get them to 20 AC. That wasn't a problem for me. So things like, what's their armor class? It's whatever it needs to be. I don't worry about what armor they're wearing. I'm only worried about this number because I want to challenge the hero. How many hit dice do they have? I have no idea. All I know is how many hit points they have in order to challenge characters of this level. The exception to that was their weapon damage. There was an early draft of the Black Iron Pact where, you know, the character that had a halberd, the warlord with a halberd, or the Eldritch Knight with a halberd, his halberd was doing like 2d10 or something like that. And I was like, well, I think that's where I have to make the exception. I think the weapons actually have to do the weapons that the items in the player's handbook say. Otherwise, the player is going to be like, can I just pick up this crazy halberd and start using it? Right? And even if I said, well, it's a larger than normal halberd, and that's why it does more damage, that's not a larger than normal character. So does that mean the chains, not larger, their medium characters can do the same thing that medium character did? So that's the one place where I made an exception, say, no, we're going to obey the rules here. And then I made sure that each member of the Black Iron Pact had a couple of different actions they could do in combat. Typically, we're talking about a ranged attack and a melee attack, but also then they all had a bonus action they could do. And my design intent was focus on mobility, getting into or out of position. They all had a reaction, unique react. These were unique attacks, things that aren't from the player's handbook. If a player does this member of the Black Iron Pact can do that. And then I gave them all a villain action. And villain actions are basically like legendary actions from the Monster Manual, except each one only had one of them. And I keyed each of the villain actions to a different turn. So on turn 1, the Master of Jackals uses his villain action and gets all his buddies into position. I originally thought that it would be, you could either move, or his villain action would be either move or use an action. But then I compared it to Boots's command action, and also just in general what I thought was reasonable. I'm like, no, it should just be move. It should just be everybody gets a movement. Almost all of that worked. The one big challenge was giving each of the different 6 members of the Black Iron Pact their own reaction, because these are things obviously that happen when it's not their turn, and it meant I had to keep in my head a list of all the different things they could react to. So I think that in general, the design of the villain sheet, where I'm just worried about the numbers and the abilities, and I'm inventing unique flavorful abilities for the bad guys to use, kept the battle interesting and challenging. But also the flip side of that is it challenged the players and made them a little bit frustrated. I don't know if you could see this, but I could see this, especially with like Phil. You could see that the fact that they had no idea what these guys could do because they didn't obey the rules of player characters, what made it kind of challenging. And that is an important part of the design, is you've got to walk that line between this is an ability that they've never heard of, that I made up, and that's going to be frustrating because now I'm no longer speaking the common language of D&D. I'm no longer communicating them. When I say this is a monk, this character needs to do monk stuff. And so that's the trick, is giving the Master of Jackals, giving the Warlord or the Eldritch Knight abilities that they've never heard of, but when they do find out about them, they go, okay, yeah, it seems reasonable that a monk called the Master of Jackals would be able to do something like that. That's a lot more of an art than a science. I think it worked pretty well, except that I ran out of stuff because I ran out of time and I was prepping other stuff. So yeah, the wizard didn't get as much attention as I wanted from me. And I think 1 or 2 of the other characters needed more cool, interesting, unique abilities. One of the first things that happened was King cast a spell, a prayer, and I didn't intend this to be an anti-king ability. I thought it would be more like an anti-judge ability, but the Master of Jackals used his voice stealer ability, which is a reaction to somebody casting a spell. They have to make a saving throw, or they literally lose their voice until the end of the next round, where they get to make a save and get to recover it. All these abilities only lasted at most 1 round, or I should say at least one round, and maybe you have a ongoing saving throw. And then the Master of Jackals could speak with King's voice, which was just a bit of flavor I threw in there. As soon as King loses his voice, he pulls out the Rod of Command, which I forgot they had. This is one of the fun parts, I think, of encounter design, is the players having to rely on items that they normally think of as being either useless or suboptimal, and coming up with interesting uses for those things. That's a lot of fun. This is the rod that allows them to command the Somnium Tenebris. It's also a rod, I think it's a rod of spell storing, which is crazy because now the players have two ways to do that between King's Rod of Command and Leech's Sapphire Rod, although Leech's version is less useful. It doesn't actually store the spell. It just recovers a Warlock spell slot, and there are lots of ways for Warlocks to recover spell slots. It's not that big a deal. Something I forgot to do, the Eldritch Knight, they were fighting at the Blessing of Ajax. His skin was iron, and anytime he took a melee attack, he was going to reflect some of that damage back like a fire shield. And I only remembered at the last minute that was it was disappointing and also frustrating because it hadn't happened before. So when it did finally happen, the players thought, well, it's unfair, right? It probably would have been more fair for me to just say, well, I forgot, therefore it didn't work. But this is pretty typical. We'll do a whole running the game video on retconning things, tiny things and big things. And, it's not unusual for the players to forget how stuff works. And I'll often be like, that's fine. From now on, it'll work the way you expect it to. Something that had a big impact on the encounter, the entire evening, that one battle that we fought, was the fact that the players rolled really, really poorly on initiative. And they also spent like the first couple of rounds, I think, on average, rolling pretty low. So that colored the entire encounter and made them think desperately in a way they might not otherwise if they had won initiative and got a bunch of really good rolls out early. The Eldritch Knight hits King and knocks him prone. Copper tries to retreat on Copper's turn because he's surrounded, he's in melee, and that's not where Copper the Ranger wants to be. But one of the villains had an ability where if you move away from me, I think there's a feat that does this. It's a polearm feat where if you try to move away from me, he can hit you, and if the attack hits, you don't move away. That really blew Tom away. He was not used to having his abilities restricted, and it meant he had to do other stuff. So he uses his officer ability where he waves the standard and everybody gets temporary hit points, which was pretty crucial. Like I said, we're not going to do the round by round of what happened. Judge puts a seal on the wizard, and the wizard is like, they have an ill rigor. The wizard and the priest and the Black Iron Pact are trying to stay back, but the players are like, we can't let that happen. So Slim tries to make his way to the priest. Judge tries to make his way to the wizard. Judge attacks the wizard, and the attack would have hit, except the wizard cast shield, which meant that she got an extra +5 armor, and the attack missed. And this was one of the places where I made an exception to my design because I felt strongly that the wizard, unlike the other characters who just had cool, unique abilities they could use, and there was no concession made to where in the player's handbook does it say you can do this, I felt like the wizard needed to use spells, real spells from the player's handbook for two reasons. One, all the design's already done. Why not use it, right? There are some really powerful, useful spells in there, but also a lot of the players, especially Judge, a lot of the characters' abilities key off of spellcasting. Reactions to people casting spells, but also putting seals on people so their spells are easier to resist and stuff like that. If I didn't use the rules for spellcasting, then some of the players' abilities would be less useful. So that's one of the reasons I did that. That's the reason the wizard had shield. I didn't know what are the other 9 first level spells the wizard has. I don't care. King upcast, we saw a bunch of upcasting, which was really cool. King upcast hold person. One of the members of the Black Iron Pact failed their save, the assassin, so he was held. But then the warlord used his reaction and said, shake it off, and immediately made the assassin make their save. And that's the kind of thing the heroes can do. They have abilities like that. And that really showed the players, this is going to be tough. Slim uses an action to power up his psionic crystal, which gives him a manifestation called Amplify that increases all of his melee damage. All of his weapon is wreathed in rainbow energy, and he starts hewing about him. He has to use his action surge to get more attacks. I think he got 2 attacks out of that. I think the first one missed. The second one was a critical. Slim has a it's only +1. The actual Vorpal sword in the DM's guy's +3, but he has a +1 Vorpal sword, and on a 20, he chopped off the head of, I think it was the enemy warlord. So that was a huge moment for the heroes. It was a huge moment in chat. We'd not seen Slim roll a 20 since he got this item many weeks ago, but I was pretty sure it was going to happen tonight, considering it was going to be one long combat. And if they had hasted Slim, it's like 5 attacks or something crazy. What are the odds? And if he has advantage. That's 10 die rolls, 10 chances to roll a 20, and that's just one round. So yeah, I was pretty sure he was going to roll a 20 sooner or later. He only rolled one the entire night, but he only needed to roll one. Characters on both sides are taking a lot of damage. Leech heals himself and then tries to cast a blight on one of the Black Iron Pact members, but the wizard sees this happen and casts Counterspell. But Leech has the Sapphire Rod, which can absorb it, and it becomes a series of contested tests, and the wizard succeeds on her Counterspell test, and Leech fails on his Absorb the Counterspell test, which means his Sapphire Rod fails to counter the Counterspell, which succeeds in countering the blight. That was another big turning point in the adventure, and another thing of having Counterspell ready, using regular everyday rules from Player's Handbook for the wizard, turned out to be the right thing to do. Probably the most effective member of the Black Iron Pact was their monk, who was not the leader, but he's their battlefield lieutenant. He's their equivalent of Boots. He hits Leech once and drops Leech to unconscious. He gets 4 more attacks. And this was another moment where everything changed, because the first thing the monk does after he drops Leech is attack him 2 more times. Each attack is automatic. If it hits, he has advantage, and if he hits, it's automatically a critical. Each critical does 2 death saves, causes Leech to accumulate 2 death saves, which means in one action, Leech went from being up to being unconscious with 1 melee attack from the monk, taking 2 death save failures from the next attack, and then 2 more. And the monk still has 2 attacks left. So he literally bludgeons Leech to death, crushing his skull, and then runs up to flank Slim. While the players are reacting to this, they're somewhat stunned. Odie sees this and goes, and pops out of existence, because he's only there on the battlefield because he's tied to Leech. Leech is dead, so Leech's familiar goes bye-bye. I believe it is at that point, after Leech dies, that Lars realizes it's time to pull the ripcord on this encounter. We either got to get out of here or call upon our patron. And he calls upon Akamitsu, his saint, his Higaran saint, and he reads his prayer. And I describe how he knows what it's like when Akamitsu hears him, but that's not what happened. Someone else tunes in. Someone else is listening, and his prayer is intercepted, and he hears this.
A scribbler. You always spoke so well of me in your chronicle. Oh, I miss those days. Days of high adventure. When you were loyal. Before your commander betrayed me on the word of that infernal tiefling. In memory of those days and your fine words, accept this boon.
This was probably the coolest moment in the session. The players had talked about how they were thinking about using Concordance, and I chimed in saying, but what if Concordance doesn't work? Which of course meant they were definitely going to do it. So knowing that, I wrote all these notes about what happens if Judge talks to Asmodeus. What happens if Leech talks to his patron? Leech is dead. What happens if King talks to Akamitsu? I said, well, it would be neat, since King was the chronicler, it would be, and served under the Lady of Brass in Alloy, it would be neat if the Lady of Brass chimed in and answered King. I thought that would be neat, and I wrote out what the Lady of Brass would say, and I went, wait a minute, do I know anyone who could actually do this? I have friends who are actors, and some of whom you know, and I went, but of those, who could I exploit my friendship with in such a way that in 4 hours, because this is like at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I could get a recording back. And so I reached out to my friend and former coworker, Frida Wolf, who played Kyra in Evolve and is a very successful voice actress now in her own right. And she got back to me and agreed to do it and did a fantastic job, gave me a couple different takes, and I added some special effects to it and gave it to Jerry. That was an incredibly effective moment, because I knew it was effective because the players knew who was speaking even without me having to tell them. They figured out even before she was done talking that it must be the Lady of Brass. The Lady of Brass sends King a High Templar of Dust, which is the greatest servitor in the Elemental Court, also the Court of Alloy, where the Lady of Brass used to be the queen. The High Templar of Dust looks around the battlefield, looks at King and says, "The Lady of Brass sends her regards. Death to Ajax." That was, I think, a great rallying cry moment for the heroes. Lars runs the High Templar of Dust because King summoned him and I don't want to have to do it. And it's great because Lars helped work on Strongholds and Followers and actually knows, he did the playtesting, so he knows how these characters' abilities work. That was a huge weight off my shoulders. The wizard casts a fireball. A bunch of the characters save. Some of them take more damage. King finally saves against the voice stealer ability, so he can cast spells again. And at this point, the High Templar of Dust has done a ton of damage to the enemy rogue. And so the priest, when it's his turn in the Black Iron Pact, calls upon the power of Ajax and gets their own servitor, gets Maladar Dictum, who is the lord of, and I probably should have picked something from the Demon Court, which is not yet published for Kingdoms in Warfare. It doesn't really make sense that Ajax would get a chaotic court, the Court of All Flesh, which is where Maladar Dictum's from. He's the lord of the Court of All Flesh. He's one of the kings, I think. Maladar Dictum is pretty nasty, probably nastier than the High Templar of Dust. Every time you attack him, you give all his next attacks get an extra D8. So you got to be really careful how you do damage. You want to do very few high damage attacks to him. Otherwise, he's just got armor class and hit points like anybody else. So at this point, we now have 2 different characters from Strongholds and Followers in the game, which is why people in the comments were saying stuff like, oh, this was nothing. This wasn't a combat. It was just a 4-hour long ad for Strongholds and Followers. But I was quite delighted because I succeeded in pushing the players to the point where they felt like they had to think outside the box and start calling upon their gods, which is something that I have done as a player in my friends' games in the 80s and 90s, and my players have done a couple of times and has been very effective. And the lesson that I learned was when I was in my early 20s, I assumed that doing that kind of thing would feel very Deus Ex Machina, like unearned, like this ally that we called on is doing all the work, not us. But so far in the 20, 30 years I've been doing this, that hasn't actually happened. The players feel like if they succeed at this, it's their ally. It was their decision to call upon their god, and calling upon their god doesn't always work. For instance, if King or Leech tried to do this same thing next week, or even within the next 6 weeks, their god's going to be like, what are you doing, man? Stop pestering me, and curse them. So there is and can be a downside. And looking back at the encounter, the High Templar of Dust and Maladar Dictum didn't do that much. They were not more effective. Keep in mind that the greatest members of these courts in Strongholds and Followers are only like CR9 and CR10, right? So much less powerful than, for instance, the Purple Worm they all killed. They're about as powerful as an average chain of Acheron's senior officer. So I didn't change the shape of the battlefield that much, but stay tuned. Slim is surrounded by members of the Black Iron Pact and Maladar Dictum. Boots runs up to him and casts invisibility on him, which I thought was a great idea, and it was going to give Slim advantage on all his attacks. More heads were going to get lopped off. But then the Black Iron Pact's assassin ran up to Boots, survived some opportunity attacks from the High Templar of Dust, and then the assassin assassinated Boots. Boots had taken a lot of damage, didn't have that many hit points left. And then I think the monk went, and the monk killed Boots. He did the same thing he did to Leech because he gets 5 attacks. So as soon as Leech is down, he can give up 2 attacks to basically instantly kill somebody. As long as those attack hits, they're going to hit. He's got advantage. And then, of course, as soon as Boots went unconscious, well before he died, Slim came back into visibility because Boots' concentration was broken. Leech is now dead. Boots is now dead. I think that's where we took our break, and we came out into the common room to have munchies and a bio break. There was debate during the break about what they should do and whether or not they should revivify, whether or not Lars, as king, should use his 3rd level spell to cast Revivify, and if so, who? And then when I said nothing until one of the players, I think it was probably Matt Driscoll, said, if I were conscious, I could try calling upon my patron. And that's when I chimed in. I said, yeah, but Concordance doesn't always work, but your spells always do work. So think about that. And me challenging that idea and saying, but what if puts the player on the defensive? And they're like, but my patron, I don't even know who my patron is. And I'd like to find out is one of the things that Matt O'Driscoll said, because that's part of his backstory. He's a drow who refused to take orders at one point from his matriarch and called upon the cosmos to aid him. And someone answered, but he has not known who this entire time. Well, he's going to find out. Anna points out the judge also has Revivify, which is something I don't think the players knew. It's a spell on the Illrigger list, but not one that Anna has been taking. But she knew that this was going to be a crazy battle, so made sure she had it for this. And at that point, they have 2 Revivifies. They have 2 down characters. I was pretty sure what was going to happen when we got back from the break, and indeed, that is what happened. Resuming combat, Slim uses his many actions to attack the priest, does a ridiculous amount of damage, but was unable to kill the priest on his turn, at which point King used his Commander of the Chain ability to give Slim an extra attack as a reaction, and that attack kills the priest of the Black Iron Pact. It's crazy how this worked out, because at this point there are 2 dead members of the Black Iron Pact, there are 2 dead members of the Chain, and there are 2 servitors on the field, Maladar Dictum for the Black Iron Pact and the High Templar of Dust for the Chain. It's amazing. There was no intent in my design there. that's just how things turned out. It's Lars's turn, and he walks up to Leech, and until that moment, I really had no idea what Lars was going to do. I thought it could have gone either way, but they had talked about reviving Leech, among other things, and now I knew they were going to do it. Leech is now back alive with 1 hit point, surrounded by a maelstrom of death. And I thought there was a good chance that this was the last round for Leech, because he was going to just take damage from something and go back to being unconscious. And so I said something portentous to Matt O'Driscoll.
Think very carefully about what you do with the time you have.
Leech... Matt O'Driscoll decides to call upon his patron, and one of the reasons, there were a couple reasons. A, I think he saw that it worked for 2 other people, and so it emboldened him, but also he's really curious about who his patron is, and so this is the time to find out. He calls out to the heavens, "Aid me," and a little tiny crystal appears in the space in front of him, and it's spinning and it's glinting off the light that they're casting, and it grows in size, and Tom Schmuck called it, he said it's going to be an Elder Sapphire Dragon, and it is, although, see, I said it was an Elder Sapphire Dragon, and I pulled out the miniature that we have. That's probably why I said that, but it was not an Elder Sapphire Dragon. I made a mistake. That's a 1 power level beyond. If you even look in Strongholds and Followers, which is where I was getting its stats from, how many manifestation points it had, how many psionic points he had. I was like, no. This over the course of the battle, I was like, no, I need to downgrade this. This needs to be at around the CR of just an adult Sapphire Dragon. But it begins taking form, and we have a cutscene.
Cut to a wizard's tower in another world, and the moon elf opening her eyes and speaking in her wind chime language. Derengar Vile Silence, so the orc listens and translates and says, and he is translating what the moon elf is saying, and he says, "Ballisantirax dreams. She dreams worlds and worlds within worlds. What does that mean?" And he turns to the sages and says, "Does anybody know what that means?"
I had written that out in case Matt O'Driscoll called upon his patron, and it was still pretty confusing because Matt O'Driscoll wondered if the Moon Elf was his patron and who Ballisantirax was, and he might still be a little bit confused about this. I didn't mean for it to be perfectly transparent, but the idea is Ballisantirax is, an eldest Sapphire Dragon somewhere asleep. They're basically gods, and Ballisantirax's dreams are so powerful that they can manifest in the real world, and this adult Sapphire Dragon that Ballisantirax conjured on behalf of Leech is someone that she knew millennia ago, ages ago, probably before there were even human beings on the earth, and it's that memory construct that has appeared to help out Leech. And when it first appeared, I thought it was an Elder Sapphire Dragon. I was not thinking properly, and so it started using all sorts of crazy abilities, and I put the kibosh on that after that first round. So that definitely changed the tide of battle. But again, if you look at how much damage everybody did, the Chain of Acheron must have done like 90% of the damage to the Black Iron Pact. Summoning a Sapphire Dragon and having it using its flay ability, it immediately turned into a angel-looking elf creature because the Sapphire Dragons like changing form and assuming other forms, and also the miniature wouldn't fit on the battlefield. So it uses its flay ability, which is the gemstone dragons don't have breath weapons. They use psionic blasts from their eyes. This rainbow prismatic energy comes pouring out of his eyes and bathes across the Black Iron Pact, does a lot of damage. But again, looking back, I'm pretty sure the Chain of Acheron did most of the damage in that battle. On its second action, the Sapphire Dragon uses one of its psionic manifestations. It uses Believe, which is an ability from Strongholds and Followers that has a couple of different options, and he used it to cause the wizard to forget that she was an enemy. And so the wizard has this moment of clarity where she was like, I understand. I was wrong. Judge uses his action to bring Boots back from the dead, and I wrote on Tom's character sheet, he has a new item in his inventory, a debt to Asmodeus, and he can feel it. He can feel there's this presence inside him, and Tom was super excited by that. He doesn't know what that means, but I think it's going to be a great character opportunity for him. At this point, the Chain of Acheron are all alive. They have 2 servitors. The Black Iron Pact are 2 characters down, and I think at that point everyone recognized that the battle was effectively over, and now we're just going to wrap it up and see how the battle ended. And it was still possible because there were enough members of the Black Iron Pact left alive, and even one member of the Black Iron Pact could kill a member of the Chain of Acheron. It was still possible that somebody could die. The combat progresses as I all think we know it will at that point, until eventually only the wizard of the Black Iron Pact is left alive. The Sapphire Dragon uses one of its manifestations to try to pull spells from the wizard's memory, but the wizard makes her saving throw, and at that point she pulls out a stick, just a regular twig, and snaps it. And I was referencing a spell that's not in 5th edition, I think a 2nd edition D&D spell called Succor, which would I I think it does a couple of things, but one of them is it will instantly teleport you back to wherever that spell was cast. And Judge tried to stop her, but I ruled that this was not, I don't think this is strictly according to Hoyle, because if this were a magic item in 5th edition, it would probably work like magic items with spells in them, which say it's like casting a spell. So I think Judge's ability should have worked, but this is, something that doesn't exist in 5th edition. So I reserve the privilege to make a call. The wizard gets away, which is, there was probably no way for the Chain of Acheron to prevent some member of the Black Iron Pact from escaping. They're so high level. They have lots of crazy escape abilities. So we're going to see more of the Black Iron Pact. And the crazy thing is, the next time they fight the Black Iron Pact, their team will be assembled out of creatures, beings, humans. The Black Iron Pact are exclusively humans who are prepared for the Chain of Acheron and have abilities specifically designed to counter the members of the Chain of Acheron. So it's going to be interesting to see what the chain does, because they know that. They can figure that out if they think about it. Are they going to use their time and their resources to try to think of a way to infiltrate or spy on or figure out what the Black Iron Pact are up to? If they don't, then the next battle against the Black Iron Pact is going to be even nastier. The last thing that happened was a bloodied, injured, near-death Dragonborn Paladin walked into the room with the giant broken diamond crystal that the Sun Elf was once imprisoned in, and looks around and sees the Chain of Acheron and is like, "Who are you?" And that's where we left it. I don't remember what time it was. It had to be near 11 o'clock at that point. One big, huge, epic battle, a lot of fun. It was pretty fun for me to run. It was only until, like I said, I feel like the design of the villains was basically a success. The implementation, where I failed to give them easy to remember reactions, and I sort of petered out on the cool abilities by the time I got to the wizard. That part of the implementation, I think, failed me. But everything was going really well until everyone started summoning all of these allies. And now I had way more work to do. At that point, I don't think we'll see another battle where there are 3 servitors on the field, but it was pretty epic. And we had that cool dialogue from Frida. It was memorable. And when the session was done, when we turned the cameras off, Matt O'Driscoll was just bouncing around. He couldn't shut up. He said, "This is the coolest thing that's ever happened. That was the best session of D&D ever." Anna was at that same time very frustrated because Judge has a bunch of cool abilities, and Anna couldn't roll above about an 8 most of the night. So that was really disappointing. And also B, she had an amazing plan to use an upcasted hold person against Black Iron Pact members that have Judge's seal on them, which gives them disadvantage on Judge's saving throws. That would have been a huge game changer, but in the moment, not realizing how close they were to the end of the battle, Judge decided to use Revivify on Boots, and from that point forward, they were kind of in a catastrophe wave that was breaking in their favor, and the combat very quickly accelerated to its conclusion. So I was a little bit sad on Anna's behalf. She was frustrated, not that the battle was boring or cool shit didn't happen, but that she didn't get to do her cool stuff. That's always frustrating. It's what makes it a game, ultimately. Slim carves the tattoos, the skin off the Master of Jackals, and starts collecting the finger bones from the members of the Black Iron Pact that have the iron ring on them, and they find an unused iron ring. Once it's put on, they assume it will permanently affix itself. It extends metal tendons into the bone of the wearer, so it cannot be taken off. And so they have one of these. What they're going to do with it, I don't know. Slim collects trophies from all the bad guys. They're going to get magic items out of this. People were arriving Wednesday night to play while I was working on what magic items are these folks going to get as a reward. And so I had to punt on that, but I'm going to figure that out between now and when we resume play in 2 weeks. Yeah, so I thought it was super cool, really exciting. The players are probably going to spend some more time exploring Ringwell before they head back upstairs. And then we're going to see, what do they do? What happens now that they've explored some of Ringwell? Do they go talk to the Sapphire Sky and report back on what they heard? And who is going to come and challenge them for control of Ringwell? Because they haven't been super secretive so far about what they're doing. That's it, folks. I hope there were some interesting lessons in here. I tried to front load the running the game advice. We will be live tonight. It's just that I'm taking a break from DMing. Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, obviously I know, but I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to tune in and find out. And we will pick up the Chain of Acheron in 2 weeks. I think this is probably going to be standard operating procedure moving forward, is that I think I can manage running for 6 weeks as long as I get a 2-week break, because this is a very DM prep intensive campaign I'm running. I've got 2 two custom classes that I'm dealing with, the Beastmaster and the Illrigger, and I want to make sure they're getting tweaked to be in accord with the player's expectations and fun. And a ton of the content I'm creating is custom content. It's a custom world. It's a custom city. The adventure is one that I've borrowed and I'm reskinning, but reskinning takes a lot of time. And also the Black Iron Pact were wholly original characters I had to invent and spend like, I think it was 2 days by the clock working on, and I didn't really finish it. So yeah, this is a very time intensive campaign. It's not a normal campaign where I'm just running some crazy adventure and I'm doing minimal prep work. I'm doing a lot of prep work and I need a break from it. So 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, I think is going to be the plan moving forward. I hope to see some of you folks tonight to tune into whatever shenanigans we get up to. Otherwise, I'll see you all in 2 weeks where we continue the adventures of the Chain of Acheron. Until next time, peace out.